Welcome back to the courtroom. I'm Terry Darrell Caldwell. We have examined the incoherence of the racial categories. We have traced the administrative origins of the classification system. We have seen that the boxes are not rooted in science, law, or logic, only in bureaucratic convenience. Today, we ask a deeper question. How do these categories become real? They do not become real through biology. They become real through counting. The decennial census is not a passive mirror of society. It is an active engine of reification. It transforms administrative artifacts into social facts. The prosecution would demonstrate that the census does not discover races, it produces them. And by producing them, it gives them the appearance of naturalness, permanence, and legitimacy. Let us begin. Sociologists of statistics have long observed that official classifications do not simply describe the world. They constitute it. When the government asks you to check a box, it is not neutrally recording an independent fact. It is creating a category that individuals then internalize. Over time, people began to identify with the box. They organize their politics around it. They demand resources based on it. The category becomes real because the state treats it as real. The Census Bureau itself acknowledges this dynamic. In an internal report, the Bureau wrote, "The categories used to collect data on race and ethnicity are social political constructs, not biological or anthropological. However, the Bureau recognizes that the very act of collecting data using these categories reinforces their social reality." The prosecution submits that this is not a neutral observation. It is a warning. The government knows that its own counting practices are creating the divisions it claims merely to measure. The census is used to allocate resources, draw districts, and enforce civil rights. Those allocations in turn shape the lived experience of racial groups. In that lived experience is then measured by the next census, confirming the original categories. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The government defines white and black administratively. It counts how many white and black people live in each neighborhood. It allocates funding based on those counts. It draws district lines based on those counts. It enforces civil rights based on those counts. Then, at the next census, it measures the outcomes and says, "See, race matters." The loop is closed. The categories are never tested. They are assumed. The prosecution does not deny that disparities exist. The prosecution argues that the census itself is a participant in creating those disparities, not a neutral observer. The prosecution now presents evidence that racial identification is not fixed. It varies with questionnaire design. In the 1980 census, the Hispanic origin question was placed after the race question. 6% of respondents marked other for race. In the 1990 census, the Hispanic origin question was placed before the race question. Other responses dropped. Respondents were reading the Hispanic question first, then selecting a race that seemed consistent. The same people, the same ancestry, different answers. The only variable was the order of questions. In 2000, the census allowed mark one or more races for the first time. 2.4% of respondents selected multiple races. In 2010, under the same format, 2.9%. In 2020, the format was changed again. Instructions were moved from a separate sheet of the form itself. The multiracial population jumped to 10.2%, over 33 million people. Not because the population changed, because the form changed. The prosecution submits that if racial identity can be shifted by moving a question up or down on a page, then race is not a stable biological trait. It is a response to a survey instrument. The census is not just a counting exercise. It determines apportionment, how many congressional seats each state receives, redistricting, how district lines are drawn, often using race data to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Funding. Over $1.5 trillion in federal funding is allocated annually based on census data, much of it using race as a variable. These consequences give the categories immense political weight. And that weight, in turn, makes it difficult to change or abolish the categories. The prosecution is not arguing that the census should stop being used for these purposes. The prosecution is arguing that the current system creates a lock-in effect. Once a category is used to allocate billions of dollars, it becomes nearly impossible to remove, even if it is scientifically invalid. The government has trapped itself in its own machinery. The Census Bureau has repeatedly acknowledged the arbitrariness of its categories. In a 2002 report, the Bureau concluded there is no scientific basis for any particular set of racial categories. The current categories are the product of political and administrative history, not of biological or anthropological science. End quote. In 2015, the Bureau tested a Middle Eastern North African checkbox. The test found that offering a MENA category reduced white responses among MENA origin individuals by 40%. The Bureau recommended adding the category. OMB blocked it for another 9 years. The Bureau has also documented that a significant portion of the population finds the categories confusing. In the 2020 census, 49.9 million respondents, 15.1%, were classified as some other race, or wrote in a response that did not match the standard categories. The Bureau knows the categories are failing. It has proposed changes. OMB has blocked them. The problem is not technical, it is political. We have discussed Nazi racial classification. The Nazis used census data to identify Jews, Roma, and other targeted groups. The data were not neutral. They were a tool of surveillance and extermination. The prosecution is not comparing the American census to the Nazi census in scale or intent. The comparison is in structure. Any government that classifies its citizens by race creates a database of identities. That database can be used for benign purposes, funding, enforcement, representation. It can also be misused. The same data that funds a community center can be used to target that community for surveillance. The prosecution is not accusing the Census Bureau of malign intent. The prosecution is arguing that the power to classify is the power to control, and that power should not be vested in any government, no matter how well intentioned. The 2030 census will be the first to include the new MENA category. It will also be the first to test a combined race ethnicity question. But the 2030 census is also the deadline for the transition period in Amendment 28. If the amendment were ratified, the 2030 census would be the last to collect race data. The prosecution is not predicting the future. The prosecution is presenting a choice. Continue the pattern, revise the categories, add new boxes, adjust wording, but never question the underlying premise. Or abolish the system, remove the race boxes entirely, collect data on income, geography, ancestry, and documented harm. Treat citizens as individuals, not as demographic units. The 2030 census is a fork in the road. One path leads to more of the same, more confusion, more arbitrariness, more administrative inertia. The other path leads to abolition. Now, the prosecution asks the jury to consider a simple question. If the census does not discover races, but produces them, if racial identification shifts with question wording, if the categories are used to allocate trillions of dollars, creating lock-in, if the Census Bureau itself admits the categories are arbitrary, then on what authority does the government ask any citizen to check any box? The answer is the same as we have seen throughout this series. No authority, only habit, only inertia, only the convenience of bureaucrats who do not want to redesign the forms. The prosecution does not ask you to reject the census. The prosecution asks you to reimagine it as a tool for counting citizens, not classifying them by a discredited fiction. In our next episode, we will examine the left-right symbiosis, how both political parties exploit the racial categories for power, and how the forgotten American is left behind. But for today, the prosecution rests on count 9. The census is not a neutral mirror. It is an engine that creates and reinforces racial categories. The government knows this. The Census Bureau has said so, yet the engine continues to run. If the census is a participant in the fiction, not a witness to it, then the state has no legitimate interest in demanding that you check a box. Court will reconvene for episode 10, the left-right symbiosis.